I think this wrap-up might contain my most unexpected hit that I have ever read, so make sure you keep watching to find out what that is. Hi everyone, Rosie here. Welcome back to my channel. Obligatory, how is it already April? How is a third of the year gone? Blah blah blah. Okay, check. Time for my March wrap up. I had a lot of reading I did in March. I promise it isn't as impressive as it sounds because a lot of these books were short, but there are a lot of them and I have thoughts about a number of them. So let's just get into this because I don't want to be filming forever. The first book I finished in March was Dreadful Company by Vivian Shaw. This is the second book in the Dr. Greta Helsing series, and in this one we follow Dr. Greta to basically a conference about medical issues of the undead in Paris. She's speaking, she's doing conference stuff, and then she finds herself enmeshed with some local, very uncivilized vampires, and all sorts of issues ensue. I remember absolutely adoring the first book, Strange Company, when I read it in early 2020. Apparently I only gave it a 4 stars, so maybe I didn't like it as much as I remember, but I had really high expectations for this book. I was really excited to read it. And honestly, I don't know how I feel about this book, having read it. There were a number of elements that I didn't love, or I thought could have been done much better, or I thought didn't really work, but there's also something about it that I can't put my finger on that just makes me happy and that I enjoy so much. Since the negatives are what are easier to actually point at and go, this was what didn't work for me, I'm gonna start with those. The first one is that honestly, it just felt like there were too many characters. At the beginning of the book, it felt like we were gonna be keeping the main protagonist, but she's gonna have to work with a different cast of characters, and her friends and allies from the first book aren't really gonna be involved that much. And that's cool, it was fun, it looked like there were some really interesting new characters being introduced. But then, basically everybody from the first book shows up. I think there was maybe one main character who was in the first book who doesn't then show up in the second book. And because there were so many characters, it felt like we didn't get enough time or evenly distributed time with the new characters. 2 of the characters who were introduced in this one were fascinating. They sound like they have an incredibly interesting backstory. They're just seem like such cool characters. Would love to know more about them, would love to have spent more time with them, to have gotten more backstory, to see them interact with other people more, and we just didn't actually get that much, or we'd get a little bit and then we wouldn't see them for a while. It just wasn't enough. Whereas one of the other characters who was introduced in this one, we got the same piece of backstory 5 times. And not in a, it's vaguely alluded to and then we get more and more and more. It's sort of from the first point, for me at least, I could figure out what was being said with this backstory. And it kept coming up and it kept coming up to the point where I was like, okay, this has got to be plot relevant, right? We're emphasizing this backstory so hard that it's got to be relevant to the overall plot. And then nothing comes of it? I guess that will redeem itself if it becomes really important in book 3, maybe? But it just sort of felt weird. And on top of that, we've got this huge cast of characters, but we've got a female main character, 2 female side characters who are not very active. They don't really get much agency or chance to make big decisions or act for themselves. They're very much on the sideline type thing. And that's basically it. I'm not looking to read a book and count and go, well, there's 10 characters and only 4 women, and that's one thing. It doesn't have to be an even 50-50 split in every single thing I read. But from a female author, written in the 2010s, with a female main character, and with such a big cast of characters, couldn't some of those characters have been women without changing anything else? You don't need to change their characterization, you don't need to change their role in the story, but did they all have to be men? Aside from the characters, my other main issue with this book was just how the plotting and the pacing worked out. The first book in this series was very much a mystery, almost thrillery type book. It wasn't a thriller, but it had that tense, ooh, looking over your shoulder type feeling to it. There's a really vague and menacing antagonist where you weren't totally sure what was going on or who they were, or what their powers were, or what their goal was, and our protagonists are trying to solve this mystery and figure out what's going on and defeat this bad guy. In this one, while certain of the characters are in the dark about various elements, I feel like we saw the villains or the bad guys way too soon and in way too much detail. There was a lot of elements in this book where if we had been kept in the dark about what was happening, it would have been scary and it would have been tense and it would have been exciting. But because we knew everything that was going on, it just didn't have that excitement, and it felt really hard to buy the character's stress, no matter whose it was, when you're seeing everything and you know that there's not actually that much cause for stress. And what's more, most of the resolution of this book felt like it came from luck and circumstance, not from any choice or skill or action on the part of the characters. There were several moments where it's like, yeah, okay, that's a cool thing that's happening, but like, have we really seen anyone do anything or make a choice or show that they have some secret skill or knowledge that can change the course of events? This probably makes me sound like I hated this book, which I didn't. I thought it was a really enjoyable book. Even with the sort of weak mystery element, I probably would have given it a 3-star. It was an enjoyable read. It just wasn't a spectacular read or a very impressive read. But there's something about it that just makes me happy. There's something about the world building and the way that Shaw describes this world that I just enjoy so much, and it like speaks directly to things that I enjoy in books. So even though I'm seeing all of these flaws in it, I sort of don't care. I am still excited to read the last book in the trilogy, and I'm hoping it'll return to the quality that I remember from the first, but even if it doesn't, it'll still be a good time, I think. The second book I finished in March was A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. This is a long-form essay, I think is what we're calling it, because I don't know what else you could call it, but it's not like any essay I've ever read before, that was written in the 1920s about the history of women in literature and why we haven't sort of seen a female Shakespeare or something of that type. I did a whole video sort of trying to work through my thoughts on this work, so I will link that up here. Check that out. Read the work. It's really, really interesting. It's really, really thought-provoking, and I need to read it again 3 more times before I actually understand anything about it. Then we come to my first audiobook of the month, and that was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. I think this is the 4th or 5th Poirot novel. I think it's the 4th, and I am so glad I persevered through the first 3, which I honestly hadn't really liked that much, and got to this one because it was so much more enjoyable and I liked it so much more, and I feel like it's getting to the Christie that I remember liking from the Miss Marple books. It is stunning how much of an improvement it is to replace Hastings, who was the narrator of the first 3 books that I read, with just your garden variety 1920s sexist racist man. Like, this guy is by no means progressive for his time or for our time, but he's still an improvement compared to Hastings, and I think that says a lot. And it was really fun to actually get a nod in the text from Poirot himself about how, you know, annoying Hastings can be. I also really, really enjoyed the mystery in this one. I thought it was really well done. I didn't work it out before the ending, but I had suspicions, which I don't normally do. I don't normally suspect the right person at all. And once Poirot started his sort of exposition type thing, I was like, oh, now I know. So that was really cool. I really enjoyed reading one where finally I felt like I was slightly in on it and solving the puzzle. I also loved the narrator's sister, Caroline, because I felt from very early on in the book that I was like, oh, this feels like prototype Miss Marple. She feels like Miss Marple before Christie has ironed out all the kinks. And I then did some reading after I'd finished the book, and it turns out that Christie was really annoyed that this woman was played by like a 20-year-old actress in an adaptation of this book, when she imagined her very much as like a 40-year-old woman. So she wrote Miss Marple because she wanted to create a main character detective who was, you know, an old lady. So it was really cool to see both like the prototype thought forming and then also to be correct in identifying it. Basically, I just like being right about things, I think. The 4th book I finished in March was honestly the biggest shock of my reading life to date, and that's not a clickbaity thing to say by any means. It was The Clicking of Cuthbert by P.G. Wodehouse, and this is a humorous short story collection about golf. I was supposed to be picking up Khufu's Wisdom, which I will discuss in just a few moments because it's the next book that I read, but that one sounded really literary and maybe hard to read, and Amrita had recommended this collection of short stories to me recently, and it sounded both short and hilarious, so basically the ideal book to procrastinate read, and I really shouldn't have been surprised because it was an Amrita recommendation, and those are always phenomenal. But this was delightful. Oh my goodness, this book was so funny. It was so fun. It was just so amazing. I legitimately laughed out loud while reading this book. And I'm going to reaffirm what Amrita told me, which was that you do not have to know anything about golf to read this book, and you do not have to care about golf in any way to enjoy this book. Just, if you do one thing, pick it up, read it, it's a delight. Then I did, however, also pick up Khufu's Wisdom by Naguib Mahfouz. This is historical fiction about ancient Egypt that was written in the 1940s, I think, maybe 1930s, I can't remember off the top of my head. And it was not at all what I expected. As I mentioned before, I thought this was going to be pretty literary, pretty dry, maybe kind of hard to get into. I don't know why I make these assumptions about old books. This was just really fascinating, and I don't even know how to describe it. The first chapter was somewhat like philosophical, political maneuvering type discussion stuff, but it very, very quickly transitioned from that to half-naked handmaiden fleeing on a horse, and it never got slow again. It was quick-paced, it was action-packed, it was very, very full of story and character and just really interesting. I don't feel like the setting was particularly historical. I'm not an expert on ancient Egypt. I in fact know very little about ancient Egypt, but reading this, it didn't feel like I was reading something where the author was really trying to faithfully convey the world of ancient Egypt to the reader, more that was a convenient backdrop to the story that was being told, but that did not bother me. It was an interesting story about interesting characters making interesting decisions, and it was surprisingly fun. This is the first book in a trilogy, and I'm not sure if I'll continue it or not, honestly. I'll probably keep it on that like maybe pile of maybe I'll pick up another one someday. I didn't dislike it, so I'm not saying I'll never read the sequel, but I also feel like where this one wrapped up, I'm perfectly happy with the conclusion, and although I enjoyed reading this, it wasn't like a new favorite, I can't get enough of this writing, so I'll probably prioritize other things for now. Fittingly, my second audiobook for the month was Crocodile on the Sandbank by Elizabeth Peters. This is set mostly in Egypt in I think the 1880s. We follow a 30-something-year-old woman, so you know she's a spinster by that time, but like actually pretty young by our standards, who's just inherited a pretty big fortune from her father and has decided, you know what, I'm gonna go off and see the world. That's what I've always wanted to do, so she's off to do it. She's a very scholarly type person, and she travels to Egypt. She wants to go exploring and, you know, do all that sort of stuff, and when she's there, she comes across a mystery. I don't know how I feel about this book. It's been like 2 weeks since I finished listening to it, and I still don't quite know how to wrap my head around it or how I feel about it. I think I had slightly too high of an expectation for the protagonist. I think she's probably a bit more of an accurate portrayal of a modern, independent 1880s lady than the character that I want to read about. I mean, I know not every character can be Phryne, but there was just a lot more not like other girls, fat shaming, incredibly poor treatment of servants, you know, very much enlightened British of the 1800s discussion of the natives, and made for a really enjoyable reading experience. And to be clear, I'm not looking for historical fiction that blatantly ignores colonialism or the negative attitudes of the time. This just felt like we're falling in an uncanny valley with the protagonist, where on one hand, I felt like I was supposed to be relating to her as a modern woman and an independent woman, and that's supposed to be relatable to the modern reader, but on the other hand, her, like I said, her views on colonialism and that sort of thing were just not aligned with what you would expect that person to hopefully express now. I mean, obviously a lot of modern feminists are incredibly colonial and imperialist, and I'm not denying that, but it just made for a very strange reading experience, and I think it really shows that it was written in the 1970s. Not to, talk down about the 1970s, but like, that was a long time ago now. It's like 50 years ago, right? I think that difference in approach really does show. And the one character we have who calls out the rampant colonialism of literally everyone else in this book is a huge misogynist. So you're sort of like, I think maybe in the next book, based on the interactions that these two characters have, things will balance out a bit, maybe, but it just didn't quite sit comfortably with me. And as for the mystery, I don't know if I'd call this a mystery. It was very strange in that respect. It took a really long time for the mystery to get started. I think it was at least a third of the way through the book, if not more, before really things started to amp up and there was mystery and confusion and what's going on here type content. The light is being incredibly frustrating. I'm sorry, one of my lights is flickering and the outside light is, the sun's coming out from behind a cloud. It's a mess. Anyways, where was I? Oh right, the mystery of Crocodile on the Sandbank. It was just a bit simplistic and a bit repetitive. At one point, I thought I had it figured out, and I was like, oh, this seems super clear, like what we're going for. But I was like, okay, but there's like, a third of the book left, so it's probably not that. It's probably something else, and this is a red herring. Except then we'd have like the same thing that kept happening, and in the end, the thing I figured out, 2/3 of the way through the book was the answer. I think that's partly because of how the book was set. It was very easily for the characters to quickly sort of write off possibilities. There wasn't much scope for a lot of complexity and moving pieces and different characters with different motivations. It was very limited in that sense, so there wasn't much room for red herrings or confusion or misleading things. It was just sort of like, well, these are the people, this is the answer, obviously, because it couldn't be anything else. So overall, it was a good but not great book. I do want to read or listen to the sequel, and I think that will be the one where I decide, because I think there's something like 12 or 16 books in total. I'm going to read or listen to the second. I'll give that a go, see if in that one the issues I had with this one are sort of worked out a bit, and if not, I probably won't continue the series, which is unfortunate because it sounded really, really good. I think it's just something where if I'd read this in 1995, I probably would have loved it. Never mind that I was a year old and I could not have read anything in 1995, but in 2020, I think I've just been exposed to so many other things that maybe do something kind of similar but better, or what I have been exposed to has been so great that this has a lot to live up to, and it just didn't quite pull that off. I've lost count now, but the next book I read was American Cuisine and How It Got This Way by Paul Freedman. As the title suggests, this is about food in the United States and how it got to be the way it is today. This was a buddy read with Kim of Bookmarks and Breadsticks, and we had a great conversation all about it on her channel, so I will link that live show up here. Go check that out if this book sounds interesting to you. We covered a lot of ground, we had a lot of interesting discussion about it, so for sure watch that, and I'm not going to go over it all again because I couldn't do it justice the second time. Another one I've already talked about, I also read Mr. Sampath, The Printer of Malgudi by R.K. Narayan. This is set in the 1930s in southern India and is about a man who's starting a newspaper and then very abruptly shifts to being about his peripheral involvement in the creation of a film studio in the town where he lives. It was very funny in the observing the ridiculousness of people and of society sense. Again, I did a whole vlog about this one, so I will link that up here. You can see my thoughts as I go. Not that I knew that much and not that I know that much now, so not super informative, but it hopefully will give you a bit of a sense of the feel of the book and some of my questions as I was reading, at least. Then I read Death at Victoria Dock by Kerry Greenwood. This is the 4th Franny Fisher novel. In this one, we have bank-robbing anarchists with a machine gun, a missing teenage girl, a very, very sexy middle-aged anarchist, and an absolute badass of a Reverend Mother nun character. As I've said in the past, I am basically completely unable to review Franny novels in any semblance of an actual review because I just consume them and am filled with joy and then I can't say anything about them. But I did do an entire video recently about Franny Fisher and how the books that Kerry Greenwood has written about her are just the perfect form of escapism, so I will link that if you would like to know more about her as a character and the style of these books. And if you're curious about the plot, just pick one up and read them. They're really short and they're all worth reading. Now we come to one where I do have a lot to say, and that is Parnassus on Wheels by Christopher Morley. This is a short novel, possibly bordering on novella, published in 1917, and it's about a middle-aged woman who spent her young life working as a governess. She spent the last 15 years serving as a housekeeper to her brother, who has become an increasingly successful and famous author, and simultaneously he has become increasingly difficult to live with. So when a traveling book salesman shows up at their house wanting to sell his business to her brother, she gets so stressed about the idea of what her brother is going to do with this that she decides to buy the business herself and go on a vacation. In essence, this is the story of a middle-aged woman who has decided to do something for herself for the first time in her life, and for the first time in her life has had both the means and the courage almost to just go out and do something that she wants to do and not live her life to serve others and to serve the people around her. It was surprisingly funny and delightful to read. Again, why do I keep being surprised by these old, it's not even that old, books? It was just great. I picked it up one evening when I couldn't sleep and I was like, oh, this is probably gonna be kind of dry and like I'll read 2 chapters and then I'll be falling asleep. I ended up reading it straight through. I mean, it was only 2 hours of reading, so it wasn't that long, but still, I read straight through because it was just so lovely. It's just a great story about a woman discovering who she is and also finding a wonderful person who loves her for who she is and who sees her for the first time in her life and actually appreciates her for the first time in her life. Also, it features the horse-drawn version of honestly my van-dwelling dreams come true. I'm going to read this passage to you so that you will all be convinced that you need to pick up this book only to spend more time with this horse carriage situation thing. The body of the wagon was built out on each side over the wheels, which gave it an unwieldy appearance but made extra room for the bookshelves. This left an inside space about 5 feet wide and 9 long. On one side he had a little oil stove, a flap table, and a cozy looking bunk above which was built a kind of chest of drawers, to hold clothes and such things, I suppose. On the other side, more bookshelves, a small table, and a little wicker easy chair. Every possible inch of space seemed to be made useful in some way, for a shelf or a hook or a hanging cupboard or something. Above the stove was a neat little row of pots and dishes and cooking utensils. The raised skylight made it just possible to stand upright in the center aisle of the van, and a little sliding window opened onto the driver's seat in the front. Altogether, it was a very neat affair. I love my apartment now. I love my life with my partner. Not looking to go van dwelling again, but reading that description, oh man, does it ever make you want to start Googling, Sprinter vans for sale in your area and thinking about road trips. Or at least that's the effect it had on me. The only thing that stopped this book from being an absolute 5-star perfect read for me was the fact that it was so short. I would have liked this book to be twice as long, to have spent more time with the main character, for her to have had more time and space to develop and blossom as a character before the conclusion. Don't get me wrong, I loved the conclusion. I thought it was adorable and great, but it would have been really cool if we'd been able to see her experience more before coming to that conclusion. Then I read Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism by Kristen R. Ghodsee. This title is 100% clickbaity, but it is clickbaity in a way that made me go, I need to read that book! So I will forgive it because I did need to read this book and it was very good. It is all about the various ways that capitalism disproportionately negatively affects women and what some possible alternatives are. I read this for a buddy read with Emrita of Emrita by the Book and Katie of Katie Reads and Rants, and we did a live show talking about it, which I will link up here because, again, we had a great discussion. It was so fascinating to hear their perspectives, to see their takes on this book from their different lived experiences. For sure, go check that out if this title sounds remotely interesting, and also just pick up and read this book because I promise you will find things in here that will make you go, Oh my god, I'd never even thought about that, but yes. The third audiobook I listened to in March was Whose Body by Dorothy L. Sayers. I was going to listen to the second Amelia Peabody book just right after the first, but it was locked on Scribd, so I couldn't. I picked this one up because it is a classic 1920s cozy mystery. I think, like, I don't know, these are what I think of as cozy mysteries, but I'm not sure they're what the actual genre of cozy mysteries is. This is about Lord Peter Wimsey, who's an amateur crime lover, and he's sort of taking on his first real big case when a body mysteriously shows up stark naked in an acquaintance's bathtub wearing nothing but a pince-nez. Lord Peter feels like the perfect cross between Wooster from P.G. Wodehouse's Jeeves and Wooster series and Phryne, My Eternal Love. So take all the humor and funny mannerisms and sort of approach to life that Wooster has, but with Phryne's intelligence and problem solving and ingenuity. And it was just so good. I absolutely adored this book, and I can't wait to read more from Sayers because I've got a new favorite. This is what happens when I pick up books on a whim. They turn out amazing, and then I've got so many more things to read. Next, I finished a book that I had been reading for most of the month at this point, I think, and that was Wyntertide by Andrew Caldecott. This is the second book in the Rotherweird trilogy, where we've got a mysterious town where things work differently, and it's been cut off from the rest of England around it for centuries. So things have sort of, evolved differently. Society has changed in different ways, both because of the people who founded this town and also because it's been relatively isolated. We have an unlikely group of people who are sort of outcasts in the town in various ways, who have to group together to save the town and everyone in it. We have major fantastical elements, but in ways that I'm not going to discuss because you should just read the first book and discover it for yourself, and I don't want to spoil that for anyone who might not have read it. This is a book where, while reading it, I was just perpetually kind of confused, and not just because it had been a year since I read the first book in the series and I didn't quite remember everything. Also just because that's the style of the book. It's not a book where you're supposed to know everything and supposed to figure everything out. Everything is very complicated, there's a lot of things going on, and the confusion heightens the mystery element. And to be clear, this isn't a classic mystery as in, there's a body in the library. Who did it? It's more of a huge overarching conspiracy, multiple players, everything is at work, solving codes, solving riddles, finding secret compartments type book. Honestly, and this might sound totally strange, and so I'm not sure if it only makes sense to me, but it feels like the book version of a really good escape room. I don't know how to describe it other than that, or maybe it's sort of like Stuart Turton, so The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle and The Devil in the Dark Water. If you know the style of his books, this has a sort of similar feeling, but in a very different way. I know that's an unhelpful description, but it's one of those kinds of writing that you almost can't describe, or at least I'm not skilled enough to describe. You've just got to read it and try it out. Unfortunately, this installment in the series wasn't quite as good as the first. Sort of the month for that, apparently. On one hand, there was some political stuff going on, there's a local election, and the campaign tactics used by the bad guys were just so accurate to some real-world political stuff that's going on. And I'm sure it was being done intentionally that way, but it just honestly made it, heart-pounding uncomfortable to read about at times, even though this is a novel. It has no actual implications, it doesn't matter, but that sort of made it hard to read. I did power through it, and I did enjoy the rest of the story, but it also really suffered from middle book syndrome, in the sense that in the first book, we're discovering the world. So the fact that not much is happening at the beginning is to be expected, because we're just sort of entering into this world, we're starting to see what's going on, we're starting to figure out what's going on under the surface. But in the second one, we've done a lot of that. So you can't let that carry the beginning of the book, and unfortunately throughout, there just wasn't the same plot drive, in the sense that the first book we go from discovery to a type of a climax. There's the end of the first book ends with some big events happening, some big things change, we have the whole having a debrief afterwards type thing, but this one, it didn't feel like there was that mounting tension or the working towards anything quite so much. And then when we did finally get things kind of really picking up pace in the last quarter or so of the book, unfortunately just ended on a really big cliffhanger on basically all fronts. At the end of the book, you have no idea where anyone is, if anyone's okay, what's gonna happen next. So it just kind of fell a bit flat for me. I'm optimistic about the third one. I'm hoping that the third book will have some traditional great last book elements and it'll all be good. But yeah, this one just kind of fell a little flat. Still really good, still worth reading the series, but it just wasn't quite as good as the first. My final book that I read in March was The Dogs and the Wolves by Irene Nemirovsky, and this was fascinating. It's the story of Ada, a young, poor Jewish girl who was born in Ukraine, I think around the turn of the 20th century. I don't think it's explicitly stated, but I think she was born sort of around that time to, again, a poor Jewish family in this city where the book is very concerned with and focuses heavily on the class differences within Jewish society of the time of the area. So we follow Ada through her childhood in this Ukrainian city, and then she moves to Paris as a young teen just before World War I. We follow what happens with her through that period and then into her 20s, and I think even into her 30s maybe. I'm not totally clear how old she is when the book ends, but we follow her throughout her life, and it really looks at the relationship between her poor cousin who she grew up with and her wealthy cousin who as a child was like someone she didn't even know but saw at a distance. And there's sort of a weird love triangle where she's in love with the wealthy cousin but has a relationship with her poor ambitious cousin for like practical reasons. Honestly, that side of this book was strange to read from my perspective. It's very unusual compared to what I'm used to reading about or thinking about in terms of romantic relationships. However, I think it is worth looking past that and just sort of accepting it and not thinking about it in this book, because the story is fascinating, it is beautiful, it is so thoughtful, and there is just so much in this story, which is, again, a quite short book, but there is so much discussed and touched upon and just beautifully written. I almost wish I'd taken careful notes while reading this, because I think you could do some fascinating discussions about it. There's just so much to consider, but it's also a book that's really just enjoyable to read. I think it's a really good thing when a book can be both, when it's both wonderful to read just as the story and has so much deeper thought going on, and you can pick which side you're looking for at any given moment. Now, you may have noticed that throughout this wrap-up, I haven't mentioned the 2 readathons I was doing whatsoever, even though I've read, I think, everything from my TBR basically. And that's because I couldn't figure out how to organize things, so I decided I was just going to talk about all the books, and now at the end I'm going to quickly go through each and talk about what I read for each prompt. Did I achieve bingos? Did I achieve blackouts? Etc, etc. So, let's start with March Mystery Madness. For the single word prompt, I'm using Wyntertide, which again, it's not a traditional mystery, but it's very mysterious and they are solving conspiracy things, so I'm going to count it. For number, I don't think I read anything for number, unfortunately. I don't think I had anything in my TBR. I should have prepared this more. I'm doing this off the cuff, so editing Rosie will put something in the screen now if I did do something for number, but I don't think I did. For person, I read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, which is of course about Roger Ackroyd and how he was murdered. Then for place, I read Death at Victoria Dock by Kerry Greenwood, because Victoria Dock is a specific location in Melbourne where part of a mystery takes place. For weather, I didn't read anything for weather, unfortunately. I had a couple thoughts of things I might read, but I read 14 books this month. I don't think I need to beat myself up for not reading even more. Again, I could possibly include Wyntertide here, but I don't know. We'll give it a half point. Then color, again, I didn't manage to read anything for color. Time, again, I think I'm gonna give Wyntertide a half point, because Wyntertide could be considered a time of year, but I'm not sure it really counts. And then space, I'm counting Crocodile on the Sandbank, because a sandbank is a general space. For the bonus, we could use Whose Body, because that was a mystery. That was like a true mystery novel that I read and that I don't think fits any of the other prompts. Or what I was planning to use for this one was Dreadful Company by Vivian Shaw. I'm still going to include it because I thought it was going to be a mystery. There's mysterious elements, but there really wasn't enough mystery solving for me to really consider it a mystery. So I think those are all the books I read for March Mystery Madness. I'm more prepared, however, for March of the Moderns, so I'm gonna put something up on the screen, but I'm looking at my notebook right now. For translated work, I read Khufu's Wisdom, and I think also The Dogs and the Wolves. I'm pretty sure that was also translated. I did not read anything with an LGBTQ+ relationship, unfortunately. For a BIPOC author, I read Khufu's Wisdom and Mr. Sampath, which again, only sort of half counts. The book I was planning on reading, it turned out I didn't have. This one was published in 1948. I have Margaret's permission to include it, but I feel like I'm cheating if I include it for a full point, so we'll sort of put that up there. For nonfiction, I read A Room of One's Own. For woman author, I read A Room of One's Own and The Dogs and the Wolves. For Cold Place, again, The Dogs and the Wolves. Part of this is set in the winter in Eastern Europe. It is very cold, and most of the ones that are set in England and stuff could probably consider it a cold place, but in this one, the cold climate actually is an explicit part of the story, so we'll use that one. For the free space, I'm going to use The Clicking of Cuthbert, which I don't think fills any of the other prompts, but was published during this time period. Unfortunately, I don't think anything I read this year passes the Bechdel test. I think even in A Room of One's Own and The Dogs and the Wolves, which are the two most likely, I don't think we really get a substantial conversation that's not about a man. Much more luck on written in the first person. Parnassus on Wheels is written in the first person. A Room of One's Own is written in the first person. And The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is also written in the first person. So as you can see, I've got some crossover between my March Mystery Madness and my March of the Moderns picks, which was a happy coincidence. For depicts a war experience, I'm including Whose Body. It doesn't depict active war, but there are a couple scenes where the protagonist, Lord Peter's PTSD is discussed, and the impact his experience in World War I has had on him is again discussed. And also, The Dogs and the Wolves does also show one person's experience with war, not in the trenches point of view, but the effect that it had on Ada's life in Paris and her family's life in general. For technological change, the only one where that one played a major role, I think, was Mr. Sampath, which again, it'll be a half point. I didn't read anything this month with a particularly negative portrayal of a Celtic character, I don't think, but I also didn't read anything with a super positive portrayal, so we'll skip that one. Again, nothing talked about mental health in a way that I would recognize discussing mental health. If I had more time to think about it and if I'd taken more careful notes, The Dogs and the Wolves does touch on mental health related topics, but I'm not sure if it talks about mental health, if that makes sense. Wait, no! Mental health, well, again, mental health is a plot point in Whose Body, but I'm not sure it discusses mental health, so I'm not sure. Changing material conditions are like a central thematic important point in The Dogs and the Wolves, so that one is clear and easily checked off. The financial status of these families and the various gains and losses and changes and what is going on in that side of the world is hugely important in this book. Then, set in a hot place, Khufu's Wisdom is set in Egypt, which is very hot, and Mr. Sampath is set in southern India, so also very hot, also again only half a point. And finally, features an artist as a character. Ada, the main character in The Dogs and the Wolves, is an artist. She paints. I sort of have a bingo here. I'm not counting it as a bingo because I don't think it's fair to include a book that was published outside the explicit dates. If we do include Mr. Sampath or the mental health in Whose Body, I guess, I don't know, if you've read either of these, let me know what you think down below. And I guess I should segue into the end of this video. Oh my goodness, I've been filming for over an hour, I think, so I'm so sorry to Editing Rosie, and hopefully this hasn't been too long for you guys to watch, but let me know down below. Have you read any of the books that I read this month? What did you think of them? How did you like them? If you haven't read them, are there any you're interested in reading now? And what did you read in March? Was it a good reading month? I hope it was, and no matter how March was, I hope that April is a great month for you. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like down below. If you would like to see more of my videos, please hit subscribe, and thank you for watching.